Hi, good afternoon. I think we are going to just wait a few minutes to start just to give people an opportunity to join. Okay, I think hopefully it's a good time for us to get started. So good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining today's webinar. I'm going to start by just introducing myself. So my name is Alyssa. I am a genetic counselor and scientific advisor at iGenomics. I'm part of the scientific support team in EMEA, which covers Europe, Middle East, India, and Africa. And I'm primarily based in the UK, where my role involves counseling patients about the genetic tests that we offer and explaining their results to them, as well as offering advice to our clinic partners and making sure that they feel well supported by us. So today I have the privilege of acting as the moderator for our webinar on leveraging the comprehensive support and expertise behind ERA to optimize outcomes. And just as a reminder, if you have been participating in these webinars, or even if you're just joining us for the first time today, this is the third webinar in a three-part series. So volume 1 took place in September. It was an introduction to our test, ERA, a proven solution for recurrent implantation failure. We then had volume 2, which happened last month, and we were joined by Dr. Robert Fisher, who kindly joined us as a guest speaker to talk about exploring the unmatched precision of ERA to further maximize patient results. And then finally today, we have the last webinar in the series, and I am joined by two of our ERA experts who I will introduce to you shortly. But first, I just wanted to start with a bit of housekeeping. We will have a presentation today followed by a Q&A at the end of the session. You do have the ability to submit questions throughout the session, so please do write questions in the question panel as we go along. You should see a question mark icon that you can click to write down your questions, and then we will get to them at the end of the talk. If we aren't able to get to all of the questions this afternoon, then we will reply to you directly after the webinar to get back to you. And then finally, this session, like our previous two sessions, will be recorded, so you'll be able to catch up if you aren't able to join us for the entire webinar today, or if you have colleagues who haven't been able to join, you can share the link with them. And now I'd like to just introduce our two speakers who joined us today. So we are first joined by Maria Ruiz, who earned her bachelor's degree in biology at Murcia University. She has over 11 years of clinical and research lab experience at iGenomics, where her focus has been on the endometrial factor related to infertility, specifically the displacement of the window of implantation and the personalization of the embryo transfer, and currently on the endometrial biome. So she previously led as the lab manager of ERA and then as ERA clinical manager, and now she is the endometrial director leading the ERA, EMA, and ALICE services. And then our other speaker today, who many of you who've been following our webinar series will by now be familiar with, is Dr. Tiffany Stankiewicz. Tiffany earned her undergraduate degree in animal bioscience from Penn State University and a PhD in genetics from the University of Kent, where her thesis centered on optimizing IVF outcomes by controlling for both embryonic aneuploidy and endometrial receptivity using genetic testing. She has over 15 years of clinical lab experience as a fully trained embryologist and is certified by the American Board of Bioanalysts in both embryology and andrology. She joined iGenomics in 2016 and today serves as the Global Endometrium Product Director. So we are so pleased to have you both with us today, and I will now hand over to you.
Perfect. Thank you, Alyssa. And just to reiterate, any questions that the audience may have, please make sure you're entering into the question box, and we'll be sure to either review it live here or follow up with you directly. So let's get started. As Alyssa said, this is volume 3 of our 3-part series. And today we're going to focus on leveraging the comprehensive support and expertise behind ERA to optimize your patient results. So starting with a quick introduction, implantation is a significant rate-limiting step in both human reproduction and in the IVF field. And if you've been watching the other parts, we always start with this equation. What is the equation for successful implantation? Well, it's simply an optimal embryo plus an optimal endometrium. So when we define an optimal endometrium, what do we mean? There are 2 main factors to consider. The first is receptivity, and the second is microbial health. Now, as you guessed it, today we're just going to be focusing on the receptivity part of endometrial health and talk about ERA. So before jumping into ERA, let's talk about recurrent implantation failure, which of course is the main indication for the test. So recurrent implantation failure, or RIF, affects approximately 10% of couples undergoing IVF. Now, after the 3rd failed cycle, there have been reported dropout rates between 22 and 50%, with increasing tendency with each consecutive cycle. Now, with that said, patients are very desperate to do something different. They want to effectively address and overcome their implantation failures. They want a solution. Now, again, as a reminder, 1 in 3 women with RIF have a displaced window of implantation. This means that they're not receptive at the standard time of transfer. Either they need more progesterone exposure or less progesterone exposure in order to properly synchronize an implanting blastocyst with a receptive endometrium. So how can we account for this and facilitate successful implantation? And one solution that came was in 2011 with the introduction of the ERA test. So ERA is endometrial receptivity analysis, which was the world's first molecular assay used to determine each woman's unique personalized embryo transfer timing, or PET, therefore synchronizing the embryo transfer with the individualized window of implantation. Now, back in 2023, we were introduced to ESHRE's good practice recommendations on recurrent implantation failure, and they do recommend investigating RIF in both the female and male partners. So examples of investigations include recommend reviewing lifestyle factors in both partners. Reassessment of endometrial thickness is also recommended. You can consider karyotyping of both partners to confirm absence of chromosomal abnormalities that would lead to, for example, translocations. Endometrial functioning tests. So this would include the ERA test, which can also be considered. And then finally, consider analysis for chronic endometritis, such as the EMA-ALICE test, which looks at the endometrial microbiome. So again, today we're going to be focusing on endometrial function testing, specifically ERA. Now, ERA is the only endometrial receptivity test backed by a randomized controlled trial. And this was a paper published back in 2024 by Barbacazzi et al. And in this particular study, there were 3 groups. The study group, so these were advanced maternal age patients using donor oocytes, PGTA, and ERA, versus control group 1, which was a group of advanced maternal age patients also using donor egg and PGTA, except they were transferring at the standard time without ERA testing. And then finally, control group 2. This was a group of younger women using autologous eggs, PGTA, and ERA, so very similar to our test group, being that both patients' groups underwent a personalized embryo transfer. And what was found is that those women who used ERA had significantly higher pregnancy rate, implantation rate, and live birth rate versus those women who did not use ERA and transferred at the standard timing. Now keep in mind, this was all with PGTA tested euploid embryo transfers. So the conclusions here from the authors was that PET guided by ERA significantly improves clinical outcomes such as pregnancy, implantation, and live birth rates in advanced age patients with challenging reproductive histories, i.e. previous failures. And there was no significant difference between the advanced age group, so i.e. our study group, and the younger patients in control group 2 when using PET guided by ERA. Again, overcoming any factors of endometrial aging. So how do we leverage the comprehensive support and expertise behind the ERA test to optimize your outcomes? And I want to introduce you to our global team of endometrial experts. We have 2 of our support teams here, the expert of all things endometrium, Maria Ruiz, which we'll hear from. And as a note, I want you to pay particular attention to the slides that she's presenting. We have a little notation saying expert insight. So this will give you really great insight that you can use in your clinical practice. We also have Alyssa here, who's one of our genetic counselors, and we're very proud of our scientific team and the endometrial and the other experts we have here. So ERA is the trusted endometrial receptivity test that's used by over 3,000 clinics worldwide. This means that we have a lot of experience with ERA, not just in one country, not in just one region, but globally. Our comprehensive support network includes world-class scientific advisors, dedicated endometrial specialists, genetic counselors, and we also have in-house clinicians. Thus, we're providing expert guidance to clinics and patients every step of the way. So what is one thing that we do in order to provide the best quality results? And that is quality parameters are reviewed for every sample that we receive. So here, again, as I mentioned, expert insight, so pay close attention, and I want to hand it over to Maria.
Hello, nice to be here. Well, I want to mention which is the relevancy of having a good quality sample, because at the end, we are not just getting a result, but getting a trustable result. Okay, so in the case of ERA, what we are analyzing is the RNA, and this is a very sensitive genetic material, so we need to ensure that it has been properly preserved. What do we do for the samples? Well, for each specific sample, we are going to analyze the integrity of the RNA. We are going to check the level of the RIM parameter, which is going to let us know how well preserved is the RNA, and also we are going to check it through these profiles that you can see here. As you can see in the left side, this is a right and proper, very well preserved RNA, but in the other side, the right one, this is degraded. So, for example, in this case, with this grade of degradation, we could not trust on the result, even if we have obtained a specific endometrial profile with our predictor, we cannot trust on this because the quality of the genetic material is bad. So we are going to go sample by sample, ensuring that the quality is proper for each one. Some of the things that can affect this quality of the RNA is, for example, the sample size. If we have a very big sample, then the preservative liquid, which is inside of our cryotubes, is not going to be enough to preserve properly the sample, and degradation is going to take place. So we are also collecting information from each sample about which is the size, if there is a lot of blood or not, if there is presence of mucus or not. And based on that, if we find that a sample has a high rate of degradation, we are going to be able to track which has been the potential reason for that. So after each invalid result, we are going to send an email specifying which are the potential reasons and letting the customer know some advice about how to avoid to get these kind of results again.
Yeah, I think it's very important to emphasize here that we simply cannot just plug and play when it comes to ERA. It's simply not just putting a sample, running it for NGS, looking at, applying the algorithm and then sending the result. There's a lot more that goes into it.
Yes.
And if there's not this careful review of quality parameters, we could have a result that we can't trust. So if I'm sure a lot of in the audience are familiar with blood analytes. So I know as embryologists and andrologists, I used to run the blood samples in-house. And we had to make sure that our controls were all in before we ran any patient sample. And if there was a control not in, then we couldn't trust that result. So it's the same, it's very similar to what we're doing here. So I think it seems like we're sometimes very specific, but it's because we want to make sure we're giving the patients the best results.
Exactly. And this is one example, but we have other different alerts while we are processing the sample that also make us to review profiles, for example, transcriptomic profiles, which are not very clear, or any other parameter that could affect the result. So we, as you have mentioned, this is not just giving a result, but giving a trustable result.
Yeah. And one thing too that I used to do as a scientific advisor and endometrial specialist here in the US is that you can see here we have a picture of the sample. So if we have a result, we have the observations available and we can guide the clinic what happened here and how to avoid that in the future. And many times I would do a report, send the picture and say, here is the problem and this is how we can fix it. So I think that's really important, is that the follow-up is key. And then having scientific advisors worldwide, we're able to really help the clinics in this way.
Exactly.
So what about case reviews by our endometrial experts? As I said before, we're not simply just plugging and playing a test. There's a lot that goes in it. There's individual reviews of each sample quality, as we just discussed, but also of patient cycle information too. And I'm sure if you've worked with ERA for a while, you've filled out a test requisition form. We do ask for a fair amount of information, but this is imperative, again, to deliver the most trustable results to your patients. So proper protocol compliance is key to best patient outcomes for ERA. In fact, we believe in this so strongly, we have several webinars and webinar series pertaining to this. We've also created the ERA Insight Hub, which we'll go over at the end of this presentation, which contain these series. You can go back. But the problem is, if we are not staying to the protocol, so endogenous progesterone is a big protocol deviation that can lead to inaccurate results that are not reproducible. We'll follow up with you. We check all the information on the rec form, again, because we want to make sure that we're giving you the best results possible for your patients. And to that point, our unparalleled endometrial team, so the team ran by Maria in our laboratory, reviews patient cycles and results to ensure accuracy. So we account for factors, like I said, of endogenous progesterone control and cycle protocol replication to provide the most precise results. And on the next slide, Maria will give us an example of the type of cycle reviews and why it's important.
Yes. In this case, for example, this is a patient who has 4 ERA biopsies. So we need to understand if in all of them the same endometrial preparation protocol has been replicated or not. This is important because we can only correlate results when everything has been replicated. Why? Because at the end, the endometrium is answering to the hormones, and its answer can vary depending on the type of hormones, the dose, or whatever. So we need to understand if everything has been replicated or not prior giving a result and a recommendation for the personalization of the embryo transfer. In this case, for example, we can see that the 4 cycles seems very similar. All of them has been HRT cycles, but in the last cycle, in the 4th, we see that the progesterone dose has been changed. I mean, the protocol for progesterone administration has changed. This implies that maybe the endometrium is not answering in the same manner than for the previous cycle. So we cannot take into account the previous result to give the recommendation for this last one. And this is very important. Not only for giving the result of this last biopsy, but this is very important also when we are doing a subsequent embryo transfer. But because, for example, in this case, if the patient is going to have the transfer following the previous protocol for the 3 first biopsies, then they don't have to follow the result from the 4th one. Okay, so it is very important. And when we request this kind of information, we know that sometimes it takes time because it implies to recover detailed information from each cycle. We are not asking only for progesterone dose, but endogenous progesterone control, dates, endometrial thickness, also the date when it was measured, ways of administration for the progesterone, any additional medication that could have been administered in each cycle. So there is a lot of information, but everything is needed to give the most accurate result when we are analyzing a sample, because it is very important to understand the full context of each result. So for us, for all the team, when we are giving a result for a patient that has previous biopsies, we always take the time to analyze and to study the full case of this patient, not only the last biopsy.
Yeah, so in this case, we weren't able to correlate the results of cycle 4 to the previous 3 cycles, in which we put on the report. You'll see a comment section saying these results cannot be correlated with previous ERA results and must be interpreted independently. So I have gotten comments in the field about, why are you giving us extra work? We already gave you this information on the test requisition form. Well, this is a clear example of why we ask, because we need maybe sometimes a little bit more information, because we might see, wait, why are we not getting a result that makes sense with the previous 3 cycles? And in this case, we concluded that, well, it's because the progesterone dosage was changed in cycle 4 versus cycle 1 through 3. But what's also interesting is that we will sometimes even send these additional cycle information sheets if we suspect there is an issue. So maybe the patient only has 1 cycle. So you say, okay, well, you're not correlating because this is her first cycle, but the result that we received doesn't make sense. And a lot of times we'll notice that it was an actual transcription error on the test requisition form. Maybe they said, oh, we gave 140 hours of progesterone, but they wrote down the wrong day, and the biopsy was actually happened 24 hours before. So that result would have made sense. So it's a good way to an extra level of quality assurance to make sure, again, we're getting the most accurate result. Because if we would have put something that say, okay, we'll transfer at, maybe it's 2 days later or a day later, we're like, well, that's a really displaced window of implantation. Then we say, oh, wait, no, the biopsy was actually done 24 hours earlier. This makes sense. And we can give a more accurate either PET recommendation or recommendation for another biopsy. So one case that always comes to mind where we utilize this additional cycle information to really help a patient was in a case where we revealed a very special observation. And sometimes we do reveal these observations such as narrow window of implantation or other observations that require additional follow-up. And in this particular patient case, this was a 40-year-old woman with primary infertility and a previous failed euploid embryo transfer. She then decided to undergo the ERA test. And here, you can see she underwent a fair amount of biopsies. She had transferred to a different clinic in the middle of her care. So she wanted the test repeated with the same protocol. There was even one ERA where they did it in a natural cycle, but the other 8 ERAs were done in a HRT. So remember, we can only correlate results when the cycle protocol is replicated exactly. So this is a clear difference between HRT and natural, but even in the HRT cycle, the progesterone administration type, the dosage, everything must be replicated in order to correlate those results. So in any case, you can see here in HRT 164, she was found to, I'm sorry, that was the last one, but before her last biopsy, we look at number 6 at 170 hours, she was late receptive, saying transfer 12 hours sooner. So at 158, a biopsy was taken, and then she became early receptive, which said transfer 12 hours later. So we then realized that her window of implantation was flanked in between these two times, so between 158 and 170. So this meant that the duration is 12 hours or less. So this is a very narrow window of implantation. Now, the patient did not want to proceed with transfer until she got that receptive transcriptomic profile and that receptive result. So she did biopsy in between 158 and 170 at 164, in which a receptive profile was obtained. Now, if we were just plugging and playing and following the algorithm and the result from there, it would have said transfer at 164 hours. But in fact, we did not recommend that. I'll hand it over to Maria because she was the one who specifically handled this case from our laboratory.
Yes, in these cases, when we have a very, very narrow window of implantation, we cannot recommend to transfer maybe in the receptive stage because the window is going to take a very short time to close. So when the blastocyst is transferred, it is going to take some time to do the implantation. So we need to give that time, extra time for them. So the idea here is to transfer at the early receptive stage, or in some cases at the pre-receptive stage, even if it is not yet receptive, to give at least 12 hours for the blastocyst to take time to implant. Otherwise, if we do the transfer here, for example, with 164 or 169, even being receptive, it could be too short the time to do the implantation, and then we could have a biochemical pregnancy because the endometrium is already entry on the late receptive stage. So for these cases with a very, very narrow window of implantation, less than 12 hours, we are going always to recommend to transfer at the very beginning of the void or even during the pre-receptive stage. We have other cases in which we have at least 24 hours between pre-receptivity and post-receptivity, and in those cases we are going to recommend to transfer in the middle of both biopsies, but here for these specific cases we will recommend as in this case.
And I think it's important to remember that, you know, when we transfer blastocysts, it's not instantaneously implanting. So it's going to be moving around the uterus and finally find the place and then go through the actual implantation process itself. So, you know, less than 12 hours of the window of implantation being open is extremely narrow for all of that to happen. So again, these cases, having a thorough review, ensuring that we're getting the best recommendation is key. Now, in fact, the patient only had one remaining euploid embryo left for transfer, She did transfer according to our recommendation at 158 hours, just prior to the window of implantation opening. And this led to a healthy full-term birth of a baby girl. So the patient was extremely grateful. And to point out here, not only did this patient have a very narrow window of implantation of less than 12 hours, but she was also displaced by 48 hours. So we're typically transferring at 120 hours of progesterone. Her receptivity was found at 164 and she transferred at 158. So timing was absolutely key for her success in this particular patient case. Now, Maria, you had mentioned before that if she would have transferred during later in the receptive window or in the late receptive stage, this can lead to biochemical pregnancy loss.
Yes, we found, because we are like analyzing which is the clinical outcome related with cis endometrial stage, and we found that for those in a late receptive category, there is a higher risk of having a biochemical pregnancy. There is an attempt of the embryo to implant, but this is not success. So we have a positive beta result, but then there is no sac when the ultrasound is done. So it happened if we transfer at the end of the window of implantation, maybe still receptive, but very close to the end, which is what we call late receptivity. So for those cases in which there is not enough time to do the transfer during receptivity is why we go to the beginning of the window of implantation. Usually when we give a result, a receptive result, this is always considering that there is an optimal receptive result. And in those cases in which it is the first biopsy, we cannot know which is going to be the length of the window of implantation for each patient, because we cannot predict that just with one biopsy. But in all the cases in which we have at least 2 biopsies, we are going to take the time to review the result and carefully understand if it is correlated or not with the previous result, in which we review if the protocol has been replicated or not. And in those cases in which we have this pre-receptive and post-receptive, or pre-receptive and late receptive, we are going to review carefully each profile to understand which is the best time for the personalization of the embryo transfer. I mean, if it is a standard window of implantation length, or if it is a narrow window of implantation, to give always this personalized advice. I mean, this is not just as we have mentioned it before, releasing a result, but interpreting and reviewing carefully each case.
Yeah, I think it's a personalized embryo transfer to the nth degree. To think that with the #1 provider of endometrial receptivity testing worldwide, to think that with every sample we look at the quality of the genetic material, and we go through the cycle information for cases and consider this. It really is to optimize precision medicine and personalized embryo transfer. And again, that's why on the end of the clinics, it's imperative to relay the information on the test requisition form and ensure proper protocol compliance, because we really want to give the best to patients.
Yes.
And you mentioned too, when we first introduced the late receptive phase, so this was a paper that our group published back in 2017. And this is actually, I think this is probably one of my favorite papers that we've published. It's just really interesting to see the evolution of the ERA test from when it was first introduced back almost 15 years ago now. And here you can see we had, I think this reflects, or it does reflect our the first version of the ERA test. So we had, non-receptive, receptive, non-receptive. Then we took the clinical outcomes for those patients who transferred according to the ERA test, and then we were able to make a substratification of different profiles. So the RR, this represents optimal receptivity. So this was the group that had highest clinical outcomes, including 80% ongoing pregnancy rate. And the interesting thing that we notice here, so this was the inception of the late receptive phase. So you could see this is coming towards the end of receptivity, going to post-receptivity. This group had a 50% biochemical pregnancy rate. So Again, this led to the inception of the new transcriptomic profile that we refer to as late receptive. And this consists of 22 dysregulated genes and is at a risk when patients transfer during this phase for biochemical pregnancy loss. So in those cases, when we see a late receptive transcriptomic profile, we'll actually recommend transfer 12 hours sooner, so 12 hours less progesterone to account for that. And the point I want to make out here is that ERA is the only endometrial test offering results with a 12-hour increment. Another thing to point out is that there are other endometrial receptivity test providers out there that are claimed to be similar to the ERA test, actually validating their technology against the ERA test. But it's always important to ask, well, did they validate against the original test? So many improvements have been made since then, including this stratification specifically that accounts for biochemical pregnancy loss. Now, another thing that Maria mentioned was the duration of the window of implantation. So typically we assume that the window of implantation was open for several days. And now with molecular tests such as endometrial receptivity analysis or ERA, we're able to get more insight on what's actually happening around the timing of the window of implantation. So not only whether endometrial receptivity is displaced or not, but the duration. So when we do have multiple data points from patients, i.e. different biopsies taken at different times within the same replicated cycle protocols, we're able to have a better understanding of their duration. And this was an abstract we presented several years ago that included 1,437 patients with paired biopsy samples. And we found that on average, the window of implantation transcriptomically lasted anywhere from 29 to 36 hours. Now, as our clinical data validates, so I know working as an endometrial specialist in North America, I followed up with a lot of cases saying, oh, this looks like a very narrow window of implantation, less than 24 hours. And in the case we just saw several slides ago, less than 12 hours. We're able to take this in consideration and really provide the best quality personalized embryo transfer recommendations for patients. Now, our next section focuses on clinical support that we have to offer. So this is more like our day-to-day or how we directly can help patients and clinicians alike. So this includes clinical data review and support for publications, provide resources to ensure best outcomes and ease of use. And then we also provide access to knowledgeable scientific advisors, IVF nurses, and IVF physicians. So this is one example of our clinical data review. I'll let Maria explain how we generate this and if you're interested in how you can get this information yourself.
Yes, one of the services that we offer to our customers is that we want to review the data and also to compare with the rest of the global data to ensure if they are getting the same or similar rate results, and also comparing the clinical outcomes, because at the end for us the important thing is that the clinic is the test is useful for the clinics and also that they are getting the more proper benefit for the test. So in these cases, for all the doctor or clinics that are interested, we offer to collect all the cases that they have done with us. Then we are going to get all the results for those cases. We are going to send an Excel file where they can fill the information regarding the subsequent embryo transfer after each ERA test. And then they will come back to us and we will prepare all the statistical analysis, also the comparison with the other global data, and we will provide this kind of report that will also come with a meeting in case that the customer wants, in which we can explain what we have found. We can find that, for example, they have similar rates to global and also very good clinical outcomes. They are doing the things properly, and this is just like a review to keep doing the things as they have done until the moment. But this has been also useful, for example, to detect if a clinic was not doing properly the things. For example, if they were not replicating the protocol between the biopsy and the transfer cycles, we are going to detect that thanks to this kind of review of the data. Also, if, for example, we are detecting that a clinic is collecting the samples too early or too late regarding the standard window of implantation, and, for example, they are getting a high rate of pre-receptive results or a high rate of post-receptive results. So we are going to also know, and we can advise how to improve how they are using the test to get better results. So this is very useful, and also they could be useful for them if they want to publish the data or in a congress or in a paper without problem, and we will assist also them for that if they need help. So I encourage every customer to request this analysis because it is very interesting to review all the data and to review which is the clinical outcome that they are getting after using the test.
Yeah, we've had several centers here that have done the ERA clinical report, and they were surprised on how high their ERA outcome data was. They said, I know it improved, but I didn't know it improved by this much. And they were also using U-put embryo transfer. So they were comparing U-put embryo transfer without ERA versus ERA. So I think we do require some help from the clinic, obtaining your clinical outcome data in an Excel report that we generate for you. But the full report and analysis, we're happy to help. And I think it can provide really great insight and helpful for the clinics. With that said, we have another report looking at, as Maria had mentioned, just the statistics of the biopsy. So what percent of samples come back as receptive versus non-receptive, and then we break it down toward receptivity type, so post-receptive, pre-receptive, 2 days, so forth and so forth. Now, this was where we found one case of a clinic that had a very high pre-receptive rate. And when we pulled their data, we noticed that they were performing an HRT cycles and conducting biopsy at 108 hours of progesterone. So they were having the patient start progesterone in the evening and then performing the biopsy 5 days later, but in the morning. So they weren't getting a full 120 hours. So they said, we have this high pre-receptive rate, which we did compare to global rates. It was indeed higher. And we recommended, okay, have the patient start progesterone in the morning so they do get that full 120 hours or near 120 hours at time of biopsy. Well, they started instituting this protocol, and within several months, their receptivity rates returned to what we saw globally. So this could really be helpful, especially in a case where maybe at 108 hours, patients might come back as pre-receptive 2 days, but if they were biopsied a little bit later, they could receive a direct recommendation for transfer. So not only do we get closer to the window of implantation in a lot of these cases, but it would also reduce your need for second biopsies in some of the patient samples. And as Maria said, we have helped clinics obtain this data or organize their data. We've reviewed them to ensure that the cycle protocols are being conducted properly. There's no deviations, just cleaning the data. And then we give it back to the clinicians and the clinics to write publications, whether it's abstracts or full papers. We're always happy to review. But this has certainly led to the success we had with a number of support for ERA. So we have over 50 clinical trials supporting the role of ERA in personalized embryo transfer. And most of these are coming from independent authored papers, so not from iGenomics or VitroLife Group. So we're happy to support in whatever ways to get you to your publication. Now, as I mentioned earlier, we do have something that we created or introduced back in 2024 called our ERA Insight Hub. And this is extremely helpful. We'll go into some of the pieces here, But I highly recommend, if you have not visited the Area Insight Hub, to go ahead and visit it after this webinar, because there's a lot of great resources, a lot of great information, and not only for clinicians, but also for patients. So this is one tool. I'm going to let Maria explain this because I do think it's extremely helpful, but I'm always surprised about how many clinicians are not aware that this tool exists. So this can be found on the Area Insight Hub. And Maria, do you want to talk about our PET, or Personalized Embryo Transfer Calculator?
Yes, this was developed because several doctors calls to us to request, I have to do the personalization of the embryo transfer on that day with this timing, but I am not sure if I can start the progesterone at this time or whatever. So we create this website in which you can easily access, and you can not only use it to plan the personalized embryo transfer, but also to plan a subsequent biopsy, because you can use it for both. And also you can select the cycle type that you are going to do, if you are going to do a biopsy cycle, a day 3 embryo transfer, or a blastocyst transfer, because the recommendation is going to change depending on that. And also you are going to indicate how many days or how many hours did the recommendation for the transfer give it in the report. So indicating all this information, you can planify depending on when you want to start the progesterone, or when you are going to trigger the ovulation, or when you want to do the transfer. So you will calculate the other side. I mean, if you want to start one day, you are going to get when you have to do the transfer, or if you want to planify because you have decided that the transfer is going to happen that day at that time, then the tool is going to tell you when to start the progesterone, for example. So it is very useful, and also for sure, if you have any doubt, you have a lot of different teams depending on the country that can assist you, but you can use this tool first to calculate and to planify all the personalized embryo transfer.
Yeah, it's highly recommended. I've had a few times where I got a call from a clinic asking me, this is before we had the PET calculator, to just do the calculation of when the transfer should happen. And they said, oh my goodness, I'm so glad that I asked you, because I had calculated it wrong. So, I mean, even, if they calculated off by a day, that could be really a difference between a baby or not a baby. So highly recommend using this calculator. Let's make sure we cross every T and dot every I, and this is one way to do that. Also, it helps, as Maria said, with the biopsy cycle. So many times we've gotten biopsies on the wrong day. This is especially true if a clinic plans to do a day 3 embryo transfer. They'll tend to perform the ERA mock cycle biopsy after only 3 days of progesterone. But this is not accurate. You need to perform it when an embryo is set to implant, which would be at the blastocyst stage. So having the option to do the biopsy cycle here can just ensure, yes, you're taking the biopsy at the right time, because I can almost guarantee if you take it after only 3 days of progesterone, you're going to get a very pre-receptive result, and then the patient's going to have to do another mock cycle and transfer. So protocol compliance is key, and this is one way to ensure not only that you're reproducing the time correctly, but you're also sticking to the right protocol and timing for biopsy. Then we have another clinical resource that we added 2 years ago. We actually have a video on our ERA Insight Hub on how to use this. But Maria, can you explain the significance of the ERA critical checklist?
Yes, this is also related with the fact that we need to replicate everything to ensure that the results are going to be replicable. So we created this checklist to ensure that the key variables that are affecting the window of implantation are replicated between the biopsy cycle and the transfer cycle. This is an example. You are going to see there in this checklist that you have to indicate if endogenous progesterone has been properly measured, and which was the value with the specific units, and in which moment it has been measured. measure, and you have to calculate for both, for the biopsy, but also for the transfer cycle. In both cases, it has to be, in an example of an HRT cycle, it has to be less than 1 nanogram per milliliter within the 24 hours prior the first progesterone intake, okay? Then you are going to see about the endometrial thickness. We have detected, and we have published this, that there's like 3 categories for the endometrial thickness. It should be like atrophic endometrium with less than 6 millimeters. Normal endometrium will be between 6 and 12 millimeters, and then hypertrophic with higher than 12 millimeters. So you can do the test, the ERA test, in all of these categories, but the endometrial answer is going to change depending on this endometrial thickness. I mean, for example, a patient that usually used to have good endometriums with 9, 10 millimeters, and then for a specific cycle, she has like no more than 5 millimeters, then most probably the window of implantation for this patient is not going to be the same when she has only reached 5 millimeters compared with when she has 9 or 10 millimeters. So we cannot use the cycle with these 5 millimeters endometrium for the biopsy cycle, or in case that the patient has already a biopsy performed with 10, 9 millimeters, then for the transfer cycle, we need to ensure a similar endometrial thickness, at least to be within the same category, I mean, between 6 and 12. So this checklist also help us to understand that we are in a similar thickness. Also, we are going to be able to replicate the timing if we put the date and the time in which progesterone has been started for the biopsy and the transfer cycle, and also when the biopsy was collected, time and date, and also when the transfer is going to be performed. With time and date, we are going to be able to calculate the exact hours in which we are going to perform the transfer. So by following this step by step, it is easy to be sure that we are doing the things properly. At the end, this is an easy test to do, but it has a lot of extra additional variables that we need to control to ensure that the result is going to be useful. So this tool also helps us and the patient, because it even can be shared with the patient, and she is the one who is going to control better that everything has been followed as indicated. So this makes things easier to ensure this reproducibility.
Yeah, in fact, I highly recommend, when you use this clinical list, not only to use it in your practice, but also print off a copy for your patients, because sometimes patients don't understand the importance of replicating something exactly. For example, if you say, okay, we're doing your transfer at 9 a.m. in 6 days from now, so start your progesterone at 9 a.m. They might say, oh, you know what, I'm going to wait till my lunch break and take it like at 1 p.m. or 2 p.m. Okay, well, now we're starting several hours later, which means we're transferring sooner. This could have an effect, especially for patients if they have a narrow window of implantation. So sometimes patients don't realize the importance. When we say start progesterone here, we should start as close to that as possible. We don't want to wait several hours. So this is extremely helpful for patients too. Now, as I mentioned before, you have access to knowledgeable scientific advisors, in-house IVF nurses and physicians. On the ERA Insight Hub, you'll find tips and tricks from our scientific advisors around the world. Just to give you a preview here on which we have Danny from the UK, Lauren, who's an IVF nurse in North America. We have Alyssa from Canada and Vivi from Australia. So we have coverage globally. So if you don't know your scientific advisor team, my recommendation is get to know them. And I'm sure you've also heard from Maria from time to time, because she's very involved covering the entire world and all the ERA samples that come globally. And then lastly, what else do we have on the ERA Insight Hub? As I mentioned before, we have other webinar series we've conducted in the past, one being our protocol compliance series. Again, we're very big on protocol compliance because that translates to best outcomes for patients. So I recommend you go back and watch that. We have other webinars. This is one we did last year talking about the correct patient population. We have our ESHRA and ASRM booth talks. This was an interview done with Dr. Allison Rogers and Dr. Amy, the Egg Whisperer. This was back in 2023 as an example. And then a lot of physicians and patients don't realize that we actually have endometrial pre and post testing webinars for patients. So the point here is that we wanted to take some of the burden off your shoulders and help explain these tests to your patients. So patients can go and sign up for, we have both a pre-testing webinar, so what they can expect before ERA, EMA, or ALICE testing, and then post-testing webinars going more over what type of results and what to expect after receiving the results. So again, here's just a view of all the other resources we have available, including news in ERA, our full publication list, as I mentioned, over 50 clinical trials supporting the use of ERA, and then some new abstracts and posters that were recently shared at ESHRA and ASRM. So conclusions, successful implantation is a rate-limiting step to successful pregnancy in both human reproduction and IVF, and largely hinges on an optimal embryo and an optimal endometrium. RIF affects about 10% of the population of the IVF population, and these patients who are affected are prone to drop out of IVF treatment prematurely and are eager to address the cause of their implantation failure. ESHRA good practice recommendations indicate that endometrial functioning tests, such as ERA, can be considered for cases of RIF. The ERA test was the first commercially available test addressing RIF of endometrial origin and the only endometrial receptivity test supported by a randomized controlled trial. ERA is backed by unmatched clinical support and experts in endometrial health. I hope we've demonstrated that here. You know, the review of quality parameters for every case, additional review of cycle information, and then the support and resources we provide. And clinics and patients can benefit from the support offered with the ERA test, such as consideration of special patient window of implantation observations, i.e. narrow window of implantation as we discussed earlier, patient counseling and education webinars. As I said, we have a very strong genetic counseling team worldwide. Review of data to help optimize the test further at your clinic. The example we showed, are you performing biopsy the right time to optimize direct recommendation for transfer for your patients? And tools and resources to ease of use and ensure accuracy with maximal results. So I know we went a bit long today. I would like to thank everyone for their attention, but I think that this was really full of good insight and maybe answered some questions you had well, why do you do that? And how can I really trust the results? So I'm going to open up for, maybe we have time for 1 or 2 questions.
Lovely. I can see we've got some questions in the chat, so I'm just going to jump right into those in the few minutes we've got left. What should clinicians keep in mind when integrating ERA results into personalized embryo transfer strategies, especially in cases where the endometrial thickness varies between testing cycles?
Yes, yes. In these cases, it is important because we need to transfer on the same endometrial thickness category in which we have collected previously the biopsy. So, for example, if we have a patient with normal cycles, with a normal endometrial thickness, like 9 millimeters, and we collect the biopsy, and then in the subsequent transfer, we have an endometrium that has not grown enough, and it is 5 millimeters, 4 millimeters, we have to cancel the transfer. We cannot use that cycle to do the transfer because most probably the endometrial answer at that cycle or the window of implantation is not going to be the same. So if you have a biopsy collected with a result with a normal endometrial thickness, you have to wait until you get another cycle with a normal endometrial thickness. For that reason, anytime that we receive a biopsy with an endometrial thickness lower than 6 millimeters, we ask the clinician, because if it is not consistent, if it is not a consistent condition on the patient that always has atrophic endometrium, we recommend to cancel the cycle, to cancel the biopsy, the analysis, and then to get a biopsy in a cycle in which replicate, which is the usual condition of the patient.
Perfect, thank you. And I think we've probably got time for one more. So how should clinicians interpret an ERA result that shows a narrow or shifted window of implantation? What implications does this have for designing a personalized embryo transfer protocol?
Yes, for the cases of narrow window of implantation, it is very important, it is always, but in these cases specifically more, to adjust to the timing in which we have recommended the personalization of the embryo transfer. Because as mentioned, if we give more hours than what we have recommended in the report, then there is the risk of going to the late receptive stage. So for these specific cases, the doctor has to be very aware about to follow and adjust specifically to the timing that we have recommended. As I have mentioned previously, we are reviewing case by case in all these cases in which we can find a narrow window. So we are going to give a very accurate recommendation on the report. I mean, they have not to be worried about if this will be a case of a narrow window or not, because we are going to analyze it previously and we are going to give the proper recommendation on the report. They have just to be aware about to adjust specifically to the timing that we have recommended. And in some cases, we have had also consultation because they have not been able to adjust to that timing, or they have to modify something, or they have to modify the cycle type. They can always consult with the endometrial team in each country to, if they face any issue with the subsequent transfer or whatever, any doubt, and we are there to assist them, because at the end, as we have mentioned in all this presentation, this is not only about giving results, but we want the better for the patient. So we keep being there after giving the result. So even if it has been, the transfer is done several months after giving the results, or even 2 years later, because the patient already had one pregnancy and they want to repeat, and they are going to follow the same result of better in the previous biopsy, they can also ask to us. We are there. I mean, we keep doing follow-up for all the cases, not only until we give the result, but also during all the process that come later.
Perfect, thanks, Maria. I think we are running slightly over, so that's probably the questions that we have time for. But if you do have other questions that we haven't answered, or if you haven't had a chance to ask, then please do get in touch with us. That is obviously what we're here for. I want to thank our two speakers for joining us for a great presentation. I think it sort of really nicely rounded out the webinar series, and also emphasizes, you've both said today, just the importance of our endometrial experts. And for all the clinicians who've joined us today, I really hope this is going to encourage you to please make use of the support team and the expertise that's available to you, so that hopefully we can help sort of optimize results for your patients, as Maria and Tiffany have both said today. So thank you everyone for joining us. Just one last reminder that all three videos are being recorded and have been recorded and are available online. So the link to this webinar recording will be sent around after later today, so you can catch up on anything that you might have missed. So thank you all. Have a lovely start to your day or rest of your day, wherever you're joining us from. Take care.
Okay. Bye.
Bye.